So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here, as well as to those who are online. As Dr. Kundu just said, we're experimenting with restarting a tradition of having academicians speak at NIUA and speak to issues of policy and practice. And we're also open to suggestions and introductions to good academicians who you think are doing relevant work relevant to NIUA and NIUA like organizations. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Gregory Randolph. Greg has been a long-time collaborator of mine for maybe the last 12 years or so, and is now an assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And his work looks at labor, economic geography, and urbanization. Particularly, he looks at processes of uneven development and the ways in which people on the margins make and remake urban and economic space. And he has a new book that's upcoming, Urbanization from Within, which is also the title of today's talk, New Pathways of Urban Transition in 21st Century. We're particularly interested and excited to host Greg today because recently NIUA has supported the ministry, MAHUA, in putting together working groups on urban reforms. Many of us in this room have been involved in putting those reports together. And one of the working groups looked closely at rural-urban transitions and what those pathways could be like and what kind of policy measures can we take to ease those transitions. And Greg's talk today speaks a little bit to that, urbanization from within, and specifically looking at India's small towns. And his fieldwork is in Bihar, and many of you may have visited and already done projects in Bihar, which is always an enriching state to study. So I'll hand over to Greg. But before that, just some housekeeping. Greg will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for discussion. So please have your questions handy. Please don't hesitate to ask, whether it's clarificatory or it's a comment or any open-ended, or you want to share something from your experience that relates to what Greg is saying. And for those who are online, if you could do the same using the Q&A box, we'd be happy to bring your insights into the discussion at the end of the talk. And with that, let me hand it over to Greg to start today. Thank you for being here.
Great. Hopefully I'm audible to the folks online as well. First of all, thank you so much to NIUA, to Dr. Kundu, to Mukta for organizing this talk. I'm happy to be part of hopefully what is the revival of an older tradition at NIUA to invite visitors and academics to talk about their work, and I hope that this presentation today sort of can stimulate some good conversation. I also just want to say up front that I'm really excited to learn from all of you who have so much experience in policy and practice that I think can help me to build upon the work that I'm doing as well. So I'm going to be talking today about this phenomenon of urbanization from within, and sort of thinking about what this means for questions of urban economic development, urban labor markets, urban livelihoods. So before I kind of jump into my presentation, I just wanted to mention a little bit of background. So I have kind of a long relationship with India, with research in India on labor and employment, migration, and urbanization issues. So as Mukta mentions, this goes back to 2012, which is when we first met working at Microhome Solutions. And after my work there, I went on to help found and establish an organization called the Just Jobs Network, which some of you might have heard of, which is based in Delhi and works in India and across the global South on issues of labor and employment. And about 6 years ago, I went back to the US to become an academic, to do my doctoral studies. And now, as Mukta mentioned, I'm on the faculty of urban planning at Georgia Tech. But I retain these close relationships with JJN and with my collaborators here. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about some work that I've been doing over the past few years, which is focused on the topic of emerging urban towns with a focus on Bihar. And I'll talk a little bit about how this work led me to Bihar, which oftentimes is not considered kind of a locus of studies on urbanization. So the structure of my presentation today, I'm kind of breaking it into 3 different parts. So I'm going to start with describing what I mean by urbanization from within and sort of what the research process is that led me to develop this term and to describe this as a phenomenon that is part of the urban transition happening in India. I'll then talk about, I'll use Bihar as a case study to talk specifically about kind of what's happening in places that are urbanizing from within. And I'll use this as a way of thinking about what the sort of underlying causes are of this urbanization process. And then finally, in the third part, I'm going to try to sort of push us towards a more policy-oriented conversation by thinking about what the challenges and opportunities are in places that are urbanizing this way. So to start with, what is urbanization from within? So urbanization from within is an in situ, so in place urbanization process in which villages grow and densify through natural population increase, not through in-migration, and in which the local workforce transitions out of agriculture. So I'll describe the research process that brought me to this definition and to identifying this as kind of an important dimension or an important part of the urbanization, the broader urban transition that's happening in India. So this research for me sort of started with this question of really wanting to understand more deeply where urbanization is happening in India. And my starting point for this was that we really need to sort of get beyond just this question of reclassification. So there's a lot of really important work that's been done on sort of the geography of new urban settlements in India, defined as places that have recently undergone a reclassification from rural to urban. But what I learned through a lot of my own kind of engagement in the field, not only in Bihar, but in other parts of India, is that oftentimes this moment of reclassification is really not the same as the moment of rapid transformation in a settlement. So if we think about urbanization as a process of social and economic and demographic and physical change, oftentimes that transformation happens before government actually comes and reclassifies or recognizes that this transformation has happened. And so I wanted to sort of understand where this transformation was occurring, where we were still in the midst of all of that change. And so for this, it required sort of thinking beyond the question of, where settlements are being reclassified. And then the other reason to sort of think beyond reclassification is that, as we know, the kind of administrative boundaries around settlements are oftentimes, they don't really reflect the functional boundaries of a settlement. So what I mean by that is that if we think about, an urban settlement as, a contiguous area that is built up, that has high population density and where there's a level of economic integration, usually the sort of administrative boundaries don't reflect all of that functional integration. So for example, this is a map of the town of Samastipur in Bihar. And you can see that sort of core darker red area in the middle is where the municipal administrative boundaries are. But the processes of social and economic and demographic change that are occurring simultaneously with that urbanization are really all around that kind of core municipal area. So these are the reasons why I felt that kind of an accurate picture of where urbanization is happening in India kind of requires us to go beyond administrative boundaries and go beyond just the question of where reclassification is happening. So what I did is I actually sort of pared this down to something quite simple. I said, urbanization is really the simultaneous, it's really a confluence of two simultaneous changes. It's a confluence of growth in agglomerated population, meaning population that's sort of clustered together in space, and it's growth in non-farm employment, meaning a structural transformation in the local economy away from agriculture. And so in my research, I said, okay, regardless of the sort of settlement level administrative boundaries, and regardless of whether a settlement is classified by central or state government as urban or rural, let's just look at where we see the fastest change in these two variables. So for non-farm employment, we can use the census data, of course, and we have this at sort of multiple scales. But for growth in agglomerated population, I used a data set called the Global Human Settlements Layer. I believe some folks here might have also used this data at different points. But this is a really powerful data set which basically ignores administrative boundaries, and it sort of divides all the land area in the world into just square kilometer grid cells and says within that square kilometer, what is the level of built up area? What's the level of population? And also, to what extent is that embedded in a bigger urban or population center? And then this data set divides each square grid cell into one of 6 different categories that are on a kind of rural to urban spectrum. And so what I did was take the 2 most urban of those, which are dense urban towns and urban centers. And I looked at sort of what share of the population in different districts in India, and also what's the total population of people living in one of these 2 types of settlements. And so these are basically places that have at least 5,000 people and have a population density of 1,500 people per square kilometer. And so I defined the fastest urbanizing districts in India in a fairly simple way. I basically said, these are districts where on both of these metrics, right, both the growth in agglomerated population measured using that global human settlements data, and in terms of growth in non-farm employment, they're in the top quartile of all districts on both, right? So there's a confluence of these 2 factors, a confluence of fast growth in clustered population and fast growth in non-farm employment. And what I found was both surprising and unsurprising. So the unsurprising part was that the districts that this process identified, so this identified 53 different districts that were fast urbanizing, right, that were in the top quartile on both of these metrics. So and it included a lot of the places that we tend to associate with rapid urbanization, which is basically the sort of metropolitan peripheries. So districts like Thane and Gurgaon, districts on the fringes of Hyderabad and Bangalore, et cetera, as well as some fast-growing sort of tier 2 cities like Surat. But also what this process highlighted was some places that we don't typically associate with fast urbanization. So 13 of the 53 districts that came up through this analysis are in Bihar. Another 5 are in Assam. And so not only are these in states, not only are these places that are sort of outside of our core metropolitan areas, but they're also in states that we tend to think of as having a very sort of slow or sluggish process of transformation in terms of their human settlements, in terms of their economies. So this is sort of the surprising or the unexpected piece. And then I said, what if we look at specifically the sort of population dynamics that underlie this process? So what is explaining this rapid growth in population and this rapid change in the economy in these places? And what I found at sort of a very simple superficial level was that we can kind of divide these two types of districts into ones that are urbanizing through large-scale in-migration, right? So these metropolitan peripheries and these districts that are in the sort of more prosperous parts of the country, they are urbanizing in much the way that we traditionally imagine urbanization, which is that they're receiving a large volume of population from somewhere else, a large amount of in-migration. But the other districts, right, 38 out of the 53 that come up in this analysis are actually places where there's either close to zero or even a negative rate of net migration, meaning there's more people leaving than coming. And this really kind of contradicts, in many ways, our traditional or conventional way of thinking about urbanization. We think about places that are urbanizing as places that are receiving migrants from somewhere else because of the attractiveness of the economic opportunities they create, or because for other reasons they're receiving migrants from some other location. So this is really the way that I define urbanization from within, is that it's an urbanization process happening not through in-migration, but through the other sort of demographic possibility here, which is internal population growth, right? That their urbanization, their growth in population and population density is happening because of this natural increase in population, right? More births than deaths, essentially. And that this simultaneously is happening with a transition of the local workforce out of agriculture. So this is the way I define urbanization from within. And so before kind of proceeding to talk about what I've found in my research in terms of what's causing this and what its consequences are, I wanted to just step back and sort of think about why does this matter? Why is it important for us to think about this as an alternative urbanization process? And the reason why it matters is because really all of our existing theories of urbanization, all of our existing kind of explanations for how urbanization happens rely on this idea of rural to urban migration. So, you know, economists and sociologists and geographers might have slightly different explanations for why people leave villages and move to cities, but fundamentally they all see it as the underlying cause of urbanization. And so if something else is happening here, then we need kind of a new explanation for understanding this urbanization process, right? This parallel urbanization process that's happening alongside the more conventional one in our kind of large metropolitan areas. And the other reason is because those same theories of urbanization, those same explanations, they actually view migration as really important for the consequences of urbanization as well, meaning the kind of social and economic outcomes of urbanization. The sort of theory from urban economists is that when people move to cities, they'll find a better match for their skills. They'll have access to higher wage labor markets. And then urban sociologists also see this as very critical to kind of the reorganization of the social structure, right? That when people leave these more kind of traditional agrarian environments and move to large cities, that sort of there's a reorganization of the social structure that happens as well. And so if we're seeing a different kind of urbanization, again, that does not result from people getting up, leaving their native places and moving somewhere else, then this also might come with different outcomes, right? Different consequences than the ones that we traditionally think of as being part of the urbanization process. So I'll make this a little less abstract as I talk about what's happening in these places. But this is sort of setting the stage for why this is important. So what's happening in these places, and how can we sort of use this to think about the underlying causes of this alternative urbanization process? So I'll be drawing specifically on the work that I've done in Bihar, which is sort of quantitative, but also largely qualitative and based on research in the field. So the first, I'm going to be talking about sort of three key features of this urbanization process. So the first kind of key feature is that these are places that see very high rates of circular outmigration. So those of you who are familiar with these parts of India, we have Aryan in the room who's himself done lots of work on migration in Bihar. So this comes as no surprise that this is sort of the pattern of migration that we see in Bihar. But through my field work, what I've tried to do is really understand kind of what's underlying these migration decisions. And so part of this is that there is sort of a long history, a long tradition of this pattern of circular outmigration from this part of India, which goes back even to sort of the Mughal era, the sort of pre-colonial era of Indian history. And so there's kind of a long tradition of men in particular leaving the household, of sort of maintaining their wives and dependents at home, and sort of keeping the village as the site of social reproduction, right, where the family is raised, and where resources like land are maintained. But in addition to that, there's also a structure to the kind of economic growth that's happened in a lot of our metropolitan areas that's made it very difficult for people to imagine permanent household movements out of a place like Bihar. So the way that the sort of economic structure of cities like Delhi and Mumbai has evolved is that, sort of in contrast to the early waves of urbanization that happened elsewhere in the world that were primarily based on sort of large manufacturing industries, that the pattern of economic growth in today's metropolitan areas in India relies much more on what we call high-skilled services, right? So these are sort of the export service sectors that have grown a lot in the last 20 to 30 years, but they require a fairly high level of education and skills in order to break into. And for everyone else who is not in those high-skilled sectors, the opportunities in the metropolitan labor markets are largely informal, largely contingent, and don't really offer the kind of economic security or wages that would be required to bring an entire family to the city, right? Or to think about permanent resettlement, permanent migration into the city. And so that labor market structure sort of works together with this long history of circular migration. It reinforces that long-standing practice of this circular migration out of these places. So we can use this to start building kind of a causal framework for urbanization from within. So we have these long traditions of circular migration. We have very narrow prospects for economic mobility in the kind of destination labor markets in our metropolitan areas. And then, of course, on top of that, in the context of a place like Bihar, we have limited opportunities in agriculture and land scarcity due to the sort of demographic intensity of the place. So this leads us to these high rates of circular outmigration. People in some ways need to leave in order to sustain their families, but they don't really have the incentive to leave permanently. So we have this male outward migration that's remittance-based, and we have the maintenance of the household in place. So the first kind of very basic outcome of this is that we have sort of population persistence and population growth that continues to happen in a place like Bihar. So again, this is different from the way that traditionally urbanization is conceived of, because in the old school way of thinking about urbanization, it involves the actual depopulation of the countryside. That's not really what's happening in India. We don't have a depopulation of the countryside. And in places like Bihar, the countryside has continued to fill up, right? Because households are being maintained in these origin locations. Even though there are these out-migrants, the out-migrants are in many cases replaced by the return migrants who are coming back at the end of their sort of working age life. And then on top of that, the families continue to expand in place. But in addition to that, right, this process is not just about population growth, it's also about the development of a non-farm economy. And so what we see is that remittances are themselves acting as kind of the underlying economic force that is driving the development of this non-farm economy in these places. So with a collaborator of mine, Arnab Dutta, who's at the University of Hong Kong, we've actually done some econometric work to quantify the impact of remittances on local labor markets in districts in India. So we actually modeled how the share of households that are receiving remittances corresponds to changes in the local employment structure. And what we found is that for every one standard deviation increase in the share of households in a district that are receiving remittances, that this corresponds to a decline in agricultural employment by about 6% and an increase in services employment by 11%. It also has no effect on manufacturing employment, which is something important that I'll come back to. But so it's not just that households are sort of receiving these remittances and using them for their own purposes of consumption. It's that all of that consumption across an entire local economy is actually creating this economic transition out of agriculture. And that's happening through the increased demand for non-farm goods and services that create these new non-farm enterprises in these places. The analysis that we did, that's for all of India, actually. Yeah. The photo on the left is from one of my field sites. This is a town called Mansurchak in Begusarai district in Bihar. So these high rates of circular outmigration lead to the sort of population persistence and growth. They also, through remittances, lead to this increased demand for non-farm goods and services. And the demography of these places is also part of what's contributing to that increased demand, right? When you have urban densities in what is an otherwise agrarian place, those urban densities themselves, the demography itself, generates a certain amount of demand for non-farm goods and services. So both of these things are acting to create that growth of the non-farm economy. And then there's a third factor, which is that there is dramatic improvement, specifically in the context of Bihar. There's dramatic improvement in the connectivity of these places that were once rural and are now urbanizing. And so what we find is that this non-farm employment is really concentrated at these nodes in transportation networks. In many cases, these are historical nodes of transportation networks. They might have been agricultural mandis. They might have been weekly hats in the countryside. But now they've grown into these permanently non-farm market towns. And what's interesting when you look at the growth in the road network is how dramatic the growth has been sort of at the bottom of the road hierarchy in a state like Bihar. So of course, we've seen across India just huge increase in the sort of surfaced roads, the surfaced road network. But when you look at Bihar, you see that the rural roads, the intra-district roads, have seen by far the fastest growth, over 300% growth in the paved kilometers of intra-district roads in the over this 15-year period from 2004 to 2019. And so in my own field work, I heard this story just consistently, that the ability to sort of to move through space, right? To move from one village to the next, to move from a district headquarters to some of the outlying settlements within the district has improved really dramatically over the past sort of 2 decades. And so this is also acting to facilitate that growth in the non-farm economy, because in addition to rising demand for non-farm goods and services, this improving connectivity effectively reduces the cost of non-farm goods and services, right? That now a consumer that wants to go to, the nearest settlement to purchase something can do so much faster, so it costs less time to get there. And of course, the goods themselves are not as expensive if they're traveling on these improved transportation networks. So this is sort of acting as an additional accelerant of this process. I don't have a chart on it, but electrification is also a huge piece of this as well in terms of the improving connectivity and infrastructure. So this kind of helps us to round out our kind of causal framework. And so what I'm trying to show in this slide is that there are these kind of deep structural forces that are leading to these patterns of migration. And then that these patterns of migration translate into certain kind of population dynamics in place, and also translate into rising demand for the non-farm goods and services, and that the fall in local trade and transport costs sort of comes in as an additional accelerant in this process. And so what we get is large, dense populations with primarily non-farm economies. And so that sort of leads us to this alternate form of urbanization that I'm calling urbanization from within. So with the time that I have left, I want to think about what are the kind of challenges and opportunities in these places, and hopefully this also pushes us towards some policy and practice thinking that you all will help me with, because that's where there's so much expertise in the room. So I'm going to talk about sort of three things that I see as challenges, and three things that I see as opportunities. So the kind of core challenge for these towns, when we think about them through the lens of urban economic development, is the challenge of kind of their economic base. So the fact is that these are essentially towns that are built on consumption rather than production. And we know that the most prosperous forms of urban economic development are rooted in the sort of tradable economy. So this could be obviously manufacturing, but it could also be tradable services like we have in other parts of India. And so there's some simple reasons why this leads to higher levels of urban prosperity. These are sectors that have much more growth potential, because the market that they are serving is not just local consumers, but potentially a much larger market, a much larger geography. There's also quite a bit of evidence that when firms are engaged in trade across different cities and across different countries, that this raises their productivity levels because of the learning process that happens through trading with other markets. And so firms that are growing more and that are experiencing more productivity growth tend to pass on at least some of those economic benefits to workers in the form of higher wages. So that's sort of typically that's typically the motor that powers the growth of an urban economy, is this tradable sector that has all of this growth potential and therefore kind of draws in migrants and workers from elsewhere. It's also part of the process that leads to specialization within an urban economy, which itself acts as a driver of productivity growth and wage growth. And so the fact that there is no kind of tradable economy in these places, right? There are no firms that are producing goods to be kind of quote unquote exported somewhere else, even within Bihar or within India, is a kind of essential challenge in terms of their underlying economic condition. Another challenge, which is sort of related to this first challenge, is that the non-farm firms, the non-farm enterprises in these locations are very poorly capitalized. They don't have much capital in order to expand in terms of their productivity or to expand to other locations or other districts within the state, for example. And part of this is that they really, Bihar doesn't have the same levels of agrarian wealth that other parts of India do. So this process of rural to urban transition, of growth in the kind of rural non-farm economy in other parts of India has oftentimes been driven by agricultural productivity growth, agricultural wealth, that then gets kind of reinvested in new sectors of the economy, right? That's the process that we've seen in states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. That's not the process here, right? The folks who have a lot of land holdings in Bihar are really not the ones who are setting up these non-farm enterprises. As we know, agricultural productivity in Bihar is much lower than it is in other locations. And so this sort of feeds the problem in the sense that firms don't have the capital that's required to enter the tradable economy, right? Tradables require higher levels of capital investment. And those levels of capital investment are not in the non-farm economy here. And remittances are supplying some amount of capital to sort of create these non-farm enterprises, but not what would be required to start a larger or more productive firm in the tradable economy. And the third sort of challenge is that these towns sort of lack an integrated approach to spatial planning that might actually try to stitch them together. And you can see sort of from this mapping of Begusarai district and comparing, I think somehow the last digit there got lost. That's supposed to say 1975. So this is showing you the growth of urban settlements essentially from 1975 to 2020. And you see the sort of essentially what is a kind of thickening of the existing settlement network. So when you see this, as a planner, you see that there is a lot of potential for the kind of integration of the local labor markets and economies across these different settlements. But that's a level of integration that isn't really happening right now. So despite the improvements in connectivity, across these different locations, I was very surprised initially to learn that there's really not much commuting happening. People are not, these different labels are specific places that I studied in Begusarai district. So for example, from Mansurchak to Begusarai city, which is the district headquarters, is about a 45-minute drive, about 45 minutes on a two-wheeler. And there's very few people who are commuting. Now, a lot of that has to do, again, with the same economic structure, right? The fact that the wages in this location would not justify a commute of 45 minutes. But that's also where spatial planning and other kinds of planning and policy interventions can come in to sort of relieve some of those constraints. So for example, in this location, if we were to think about an integrated approach to transportation that would, to some extent, subsidize the cost of transportation among these different locations in this district, that could be a stepping stone toward a more integrated regional labor market, which might have some then benefits in terms of facilitating this process of economic development and agglomeration, right? If the firms in the district headquarters are able to draw from sort of the skills and experiences of workers across this different district, as opposed to just from the immediate vicinity, that could have potential productivity enhancements. So these are the challenges. And now I want to talk about sort of three things that I see as opportunities. So one opportunity is that there is some evidence that return migrants are thinking about how to utilize the skills that they've gained from working in other parts of the country to develop enterprises back in their hometown. So like I said, much of the non-farm economy is very poorly capitalized. It's mostly own account, sort of sole proprietorship enterprises. But this story of this particular return migrant I found to be very interesting, and something, a story that we could potentially think about how to scale from a policy perspective. So Raj Kumar, this is an alias I've given him for the purpose of my research, he left Mansurchak in Begusarai district as an orphan when he was about 10 years old. He worked as a child laborer in different parts of the country, so he came from an extreme disadvantage. Eventually landed in Panipat, where he was working in a commercial bakery. And when he eventually decided to move back to Mansurchak, he had all of the sort of knowledge of how these commercial bakery equipments work, such that he started a manufacturing enterprise where he manufactures this commercial bakery equipment. Now, he at this point is an anomaly, right? Most return migrants are not able to sort of utilize the skills and knowledge and labor market experiences from outside in order to create these kinds of manufacturing tradable industries. But this is a story that we could think about from a policy perspective. How do we scale this, right? How do we make this more possible for more people? Because from a livelihoods perspective, Rajkumar now employs 25 people to work in this manufacturing firm that he's created. Another opportunity that I see is that, from my experiences in the field, I've seen that both the sort of consumers, but also the entrepreneurs in this non-farm economy tend to come from non-elite backgrounds. So again, this sort of contrasts with the story of non-farm economic development that we've seen in other parts of the country, where it's sort of those with some amount of agrarian wealth who have some kind of elite status within agrarian society that are then able to take that wealth and create non-farm economy, a non-farm enterprise. So here what we see is something quite different, which is that it's those communities that have been engaged in this circular migration over multiple generations that are creating these non-farm enterprises. And something that was very interesting in my research in Mansurchak is that or in Begusarai district, is that I actually found that the sort of market towns that are growing and developing the fastest in terms of their non-farm enterprises are actually the ones where there is a lower concentration of the kind of elite land-owning caste, right? So in this context, that's the Bhumiyars. So the parts of the district that have a larger Bhumiyar presence are the ones that have a smaller non-farm economy. The parts of the district that have more representation of SC, OBC, and Muslim populations are the ones that have higher levels of non-farm economic activity. Again, because those are the communities that have been engaged in this circular migration and the ones that are now creating these non-farm enterprises. And also because the non-farm economy has been able to develop more in places where there's been less of a threat of caste-based intimidation. So people specifically said it's developed in Mansurchak because they use this euphemistic term of ekta. There is unity in this place. And when I sort of peeled back the layers and said, well, what does ekta mean? I got to the conclusion that it's a place where sort of the populations that were historically oppressed by the landowning caste sort of had enough demographic representation that they could patronize one another's businesses, and they were effectively shielded from some of that caste-based intimidation or other tactics that have been used historically to sort of suppress these other pathways to sort of economic mobility, right? If you're in the landowning caste, you don't want to see a lot of non-farm economic activity because it reduces your labor supply for your land. So this is an interesting dynamic that I think is an opportunity, because it suggests that if we could grow these types of enterprises, if we could give them more capital or more opportunity for growth, more scope for entering the tradable economy, that the groups we would empower in the process are those that have historically been marginalized. And the last opportunity here is sort of specific to Bihar, but I'd be curious to know if you all see this kind of activity or potential in other states as well, is that the government of Bihar has started to sort of recognize the urbanization that's happening in these places. So I mentioned sort of right at the beginning that oftentimes reclassification happens after the urban transformation has already taken place. The government of Bihar is actually trying to recognize these places as urban while they're in the midst of that urban transformation. So in 2022, they relaxed some of the requirements of their own state level definition of a statutory town in order to expand the number of statutory towns and bring urban schemes to more places. So they almost doubled the number of urban local bodies in the state, which means that from a sort of governance and policy perspective, there is kind of a new opportunity for us to think about implementation of urban schemes in these places, how to make urban schemes as implementable as possible in these kind of transitioning places, and how to enhance their impact on urban economic development. So just to kind of summarize the three key elements of the talk, many of India's rapidly urbanizing districts are what I've called urbanizing from within. And I've argued that this calls for kind of new explanations for urbanization, but also new policy approaches to managing urbanization. Through this work in Bihar, I've argued that this process is driven by the demographic and economic consequences of circular migration, alongside these infrastructure improvements that have increased the possibilities for non-farm consumption. And finally, I've argued that there are sort of different challenges and opportunities in these places. The primary challenge being the structure of these local economies, the fact that they are unspecialized, non-tradable, and poorly capitalized, but also that they have a kind of social structure and a new level of recognition that present some positive possibilities. So I'll stop there. I know that I've spoken longer than promised, but I'm excited for the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Greg. We have questions already coming in on Zoom, and we'd be happy to open the floor. But before I do, thank you so much for focusing a little bit, and maybe we can push you a little bit more in the questions on the livelihoods aspect. The talk today has been sort of curated by the Center for Sustainable Urban Livelihoods here at NIUA, and deliberately we wanted the first speaker to have a link, have something to say to the larger issue of urbanization, but also bring a focus on work, employment, and livelihood. So thank you so much for doing that. And the floor is open. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. So why don't you go first?
So, we are doing a study with the World Bank on urbanization and jobs, where, again, the bank is doing the GIS mapping and the quantitative analysis. So where I found that, as you rightly pointed out, like this, the entire Bihar state is very dense in terms of the nightlife. Mm-hmm. I was unable to understand. Now I do after I listened to your presentation. So what I understood is that because of non-farm employment coming over in the villages, there has been sectoral diversity. Mm-hmm. And from the figures from 142 to 58, that means new statutory towns have come, right? Mm-hmm. So my question to you is that whether these are census towns being converted into statutory towns, or they are statutory towns being announced by the government as they do from time to time.
Yeah, that's a good question. So interestingly, the way that this dramatic expansion of statutory towns happened was that the state government decided to relax their sort of requirements specifically around non-farm employment. So of course, census towns, because they meet the census definition, already have 75% or more of male workers in non-farm employment. The state government said, we're actually going to, for our own purposes of classifying statutory towns, we're going to bring that down to 50%. So, so that sort of automatically enabled this huge expansion in the number, because there were so many places in Bihar that had, of course, the demography is never an issue in Bihar in terms of urbanization, because we have such high population densities. But it enabled places that were sort of in this 50 to 75% range of non-farm employment to receive urban local bodies. And there's so many places that are in that transitional space that expanded that number so dramatically. But what's interesting is we still see this problem of administrative boundaries. So Mansurchak, the town that I showed, is classified as a census town because it has about 80% of its workers in non-farm employment. But it was not given an urban local body. It did not become a statutory town. And the reason for that is because its population is still technically below 12,000, which is the statutory town threshold that Bihar uses. But it doesn't really make any sense because it's just that the administrative boundaries themselves below that threshold. It's within a population agglomeration of about 80,000 people, but that's composed of many different administrative settlements. So there's still a challenge in terms of like moving beyond this kind of and being willing to kind of combine and join different settlements in order to form larger urban local bodies. But of course, that raises different political questions as well.
And you also raised a dichotomy in the manner the cities grow. One, you said in and around the metropolitan cities, there is an inward migration. Whereas in the hinterland, rural hinterland, it is from within.
Right.
More of population increasing and sectoral diversification happening.
That's right.
So my question is to the first pattern. When you're talking about people moving in, have you also looked at whether they are moving in from small towns? Is it a step migration, or it is for the first time from the rural areas?
That's a great question. I have not specifically looked at that particular empirical question.
Data, I think it's difficult.
And yeah, I mean, there should be a way of analyzing that to some extent. Mukta has looked at this kind of step migration in her work, but no, I mean, in my work, because that sort of inward migration represents sort of in many ways the more traditional way that we think about urbanization. I didn't focus as much on it in my work because I was trying to understand, okay, what is all of this urban growth happening in places that we don't associate with urbanization? But that's a great question, especially because there could be a relationship between these two forms of urbanization, right? That maybe Mansurchak urbanizes and then people move from Mansurchak to the urban peripheries and metropolitan areas.
Likely to happen.
Right.
And my last question. Pardon me if it sounds very stupid to you, but I have one question. Why are you calling it circular migration?
Yeah.
Are people coming back? You mentioned that it's male selected, right?
Yeah.
The male member is moving out of the village.
Yeah.
So is he again coming back?
Yeah. So I'm using that's a great question. So I'm using circular migration here in a pretty expansive sense to think about essentially migration patterns that involve the expectation of return. And so some of the people that I interview are people who have had 4 to 5 different migration stints in different parts of the country for 8 to 9 months each, and then they've returned permanently. Others are people who are spending the majority of their working lives in one particular destination. They're coming back for 2 months every year, but they eventually plan to retire, so to speak, in the village. So I would say there's varied levels of permanence and varied durations and varied numbers of destinations. As we all know, these are very complex kind of migration patterns. But I'm using the term because I think what's important here is that it enables this sort of demographic growth and economic change in these places of origin, because the fact that the household's being maintained in the place of origin means that the population continues to grow, and it also means that there is this influx of remittances that's driving this economic change.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you, ma'am. Those were great questions, and Greg responded also beautifully to them. Anybody else? I think it would be great to have the discussion in the room going. I know that people may have other meetings and other engagements. So before the crowd starts thinning out, Anand, Aditya, Sahil, Iftikhar, noted your questions. I'll just come back to them in a minute after taking a few from the room. Anyone, or I can take one of the questions. Okay. Aryan and then Sneha. Maybe we can take. Okay. So we can take these three. And Greg, can we take them in bunches of three?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So Aryan, why don't you start?
Thanks, first of all. I think this is really interesting. Whereas my work is almost like it was rural structure of migration, but I don't know how you see
It's the evolution of that process in a way.
it's almost like, Lalu Prasad settling in small towns, right? That's what you see happening here. My question was, and I think the numbers they're all India, so I'm not sure if they apply. But what I always thought was that the rural to urban migration kept the agriculture economy at alive, if you like, right? It's fairly stagnant, and now I feel that it's doing. Maybe there's a bit more growth. It's doing the same to the service economy. From your national numbers, right? Because it keeps remittances keep the service economy in small towns growing, right? That if I understand it correctly. Are people migrating less? Is there less circular migration now? Or do we still see the same rates about migration?
Okay. Vishwajit, do you want to come up here? And just speak up because there are people online also, yeah.
So it's an excellent presentation. So my question is, just you said, urbanization is going beyond the boundary, right? Means it's spreading beyond the administrative boundaries. So now the point is, then if the nature is like it's not contained within an area, then how should we define or how should we classify it's a urban or it's this place is a rural? So is there any idea to classify this to, do you have any such criteria or any such parameters to define these two terms? It's a urban or it's a rural
Or transitional.
or transitional area.
Sneha, just put on, make sure you have the mic on, please.
Yeah, so my question, one of the ideas that I found most interesting was how you told that the village gets maintained as a site of social reproduction, supporting the labor, mostly the male labor that migrates out. So I wanted to understand what you witnessed in terms of the implications of that for the gender dynamics within the household, and specifically for, so if the women are left behind sort of in these villages, and then there is a simultaneous rise in non-farm employment. So what does that say towards, women's employment and the shift in occupation pattern?
Yeah. Do you want to take them and then maybe we can move to the online questions?
So to your question, Aryan, of course, migration data are really difficult to work with, especially in the Indian context. A lot of this work was based on the 64th round of the NSS, which is already so old, but it's some of the best migration data that we have for looking at these more complicated questions. But I think that my understanding is that the scale of this migration has increased, and that in some ways, the increase of this pattern of migration also helps to explain why it's now actually translating into structural change in these origin communities, because the remittance flows themselves are now so large that they have the capacity for actually restructuring local labor markets. Whereas, of course, this pattern of migration is something that's existed before, but maybe hadn't reached so many different segments of the population. So that's my understanding of that relationship there. I don't know if you want to say anything further, how that relates to your question. Okay. So in terms of the question around administrative boundaries, I mean, I think that it's my perspective on this is that the administrative definitions that we have and the administrative boundaries that we create should be for the purpose of good governance in the places that we want to govern, right? So there's sort of two different issues bound up in what you're saying. One is sort of how do administrative boundaries evolve to reflect the evolution of human settlements? And so I think in that sense, it's either about creating, new administrative boundaries to combine different settlements that have effectively grown together, or it's about expanding the, existing boundaries to reflect the outgrowth, right, of urban areas. But I think that the deeper question in India is more around the issue of how bifurcated should our governance structure be, right? Should we have a set of schemes for rural and a set of schemes for urban, or should we have instead schemes be designed based on the problem they're trying to resolve, right? And there are certain kinds of governance needs that are common to places that are high density, right? Regardless of what the structure of their economy is. There's other kinds of schemes that are required for places that have large informal economies, others that might be required for places that have, like the ones I've described, a large non-farm economy, but very little, formality, very little capital, very little in terms of a tradable sector. So I think that's the deeper issue, right? Is to what extent are we imagining that this one binary of rural versus urban can encapsulate so many different kinds of governance needs that we sort of are bifurcating our schemes accordingly. So I don't know if that exactly, or maybe it changes the nature of your question a little bit, but I think it's important. And then on the gender dynamics, so here I'll borrow from some other folks' work because in my own research I didn't focus as directly on the gender dynamics, but it's a very interesting question. So some of the work that's been done by other folks who are studying this urban emergence in Bihar, Robin Van Dwyne and Jan Nijman and Chetan Chaitani. So what they have found, and I hope it's okay if I share this because I think it's from a forthcoming manuscript, but I'm citing their forthcoming manuscript. They found something very interesting, which is that the households that are receiving remittances, oftentimes there is a process of household nuclearization. So joint families that used to manage all of their assets and expenses and everything together. There's something about the receipt of remittances that causes those households to sort of break up, those joint families to break up their household finances, their cooking, et cetera, into discrete nuclear family units. So in many cases, they're still living on the same, joint plot of land, but they will build a separate structure that has a separate kitchen, and they'll start managing their finances separately because this kind of reduces the potential conflict over how the remittances are used. And so what they find in that process is that women in those kind of newly nuclearized households have somewhat more independence or autonomy in financial decision making than women in households where there is not that out-migrant plus remittances. So in my experience, I'm not at all seeing this show up in actual labor market participation. These non-farm market towns that I'm talking about, there's almost no female entrepreneurship that I've seen. There are some women working in, obviously, schools and health clinics and, in the, motorbike showrooms, for example, and kind of accounting or admin sort of functions, but there's very little female entrepreneurship. So I think that to the extent that this has an impact on gender dynamics, I think it's still kind of at this intra-household level as opposed to something we see in the broader labor market at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the questions online because I know Sahil and Aditya are probably waiting very patiently to come to that. So Sahil has a question. He says, based on the factors you outlined that drive urbanization from within, would you agree that metropolitan peripheries and their urbanization processes also involve a combination of in-migration and urbanization from within? So basically, he's asking, how would you extend your analytical frame to studying a larger city like a Mumbai or a Delhi region? Can that be done? Would you do it? And if so, how? So that's one question. And the second question is in politics. You seem to be describing a process of urbanization in place, but also a context where livelihoods are constrained and informal. So do you see this phenomenon? This is Aditya's question. Do you see this phenomena changing the way politics is organized or transacted? For instance, the dynamics you describe around changing class structures and caste dynamics, how have political parties responded to these changes? Did you see any change in the political responses? So those are two questions. And the third from Anand Raj. Anand, I'm not going to ask Greg to answer how he chose Bihar because that is what he started his talk with, and we'll be sharing this and you can look it up there. But he's talking about location-based gig and platform workers. And he says, I come from Motihari, and in 2022, Motihari became a municipal corporation. How do you see the evolution of gig economy in these kind of urbanization? In the places that you studied? Three very, very different questions.
Okay. Yeah, these are all really interesting questions. So in terms of the question of the metropolitan peripheries, so I guess what I would say is I'm open to the possibility that urbanization from within, as I define it, may be occurring in those locations. But I think that what distinguishes this as a phenomenon is that it does not involve the in-migration of people or the kind of concentrated capital that we see in the metropolitan peripheries. So all urbanization processes have always involved some, natural population increase. And, interestingly, in many countries in the global South, that natural population increase is responsible for more of the urban population growth than is migration. But I think what is distinctive, or what we don't really have kind of theories or explanations for, is a situation in which you actually see more out migration than in migration, and yet urbanization is also unfolding. So a place in, on the peripheries of Delhi that has some natural population increase and inward migration, with the inward migration being driven by some kind of industrialization process that involves, concentration of formal capital investment, I wouldn't see that as something different than kind of urbanization as we've always known it. That doesn't mean there aren't other things happening in those places that are distinctive in their own way, but I wouldn't call it just another form of urbanization from within. I think this is something distinctive. In terms of the caste dynamics, I mean, this is a really interesting question. So I'll answer this by sharing an anecdote from the field work. So I mentioned that the places that are seeing the fastest growth in their non-farm economies are places that have sort of lower demographic concentration of the landowning caste. They also tend to be places that have some amount of caste diversity and are therefore politically and electorally competitive. So, and that's related to also the infrastructure piece, is that a lot of where you've seen the sort of prioritizing of, resurfacing rural roads, improving connectivity, building new bridges to connect places across, water bodies, et cetera, are in areas where there's quite a bit of caste and religious diversity, and therefore political parties feel that they need to compete more for those areas. So that sort of seems to again relate to the way in which caste diversity and sort of the sort of presence of non-elite caste groups seems to somehow be working in favor of this growth of the economy. What the long-term implications are for, potential restructuring of Bihar's electoral politics, I'm not totally sure, but I would love to think with you all about that.
Yeah.
And then the last question on the gig economy. So I think what's important about this is it relates to another issue for a lot of these non-farm enterprises. So I'm now doing some work in Bhagalpur in a different district in Bihar, and one thing that's coming up in that work much more consistently than came up in this initial work, which I did sort of 2 to 3 years ago, is the issue of e-commerce. So all of these non-farm enterprises now feel very, very threatened by the growth of e-commerce platforms. And I think it speaks to the fact that, these are basically firms that are competing purely on cost. They're not really offering anything else of product differentiation or value add. They're basically just distribution facilities for goods, and so that makes them very vulnerable to all different kinds of changes, not only in terms of technology like the rise of e-commerce, but also can imagine that if connectivity and infrastructure continue to improve, right, that eventually people will be bypassing these smaller towns and heading straight to the larger market where there's a wider range of goods and services. So we're kind of in this unique transitional moment where these are places where the right confluence of factors have come together to enable these market towns to form. But I don't think we should think of them as having durable economies in any sense. I think we have to figure out what sorts of policy interventions could allow these local economies to upgrade themselves.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the room? Kanu, Kanika, and yeah, why don't you come up to the mic, the seat there, right? So yeah, maybe Kanika can start. And
there are two questions. One is actually, one is kind of building on to the Belina ma'am's question about circular migration. And so the quality of circular migration also would be impacting on how what do they want to do? I mean, probably a person who's coming back every 6 months vis-a-vis a person who's coming back to retire would actually determine the economic growth of that particular town. So, I mean, is there any insight on that particular aspect in your study? The second is, which you had mentioned about, a challenge as well as an opportunity about the integrated approach to spatial planning. And when we are talking about integrated approach to spatial planning, it's not only like transportation, but also the hierarchy of the opportunities and services that particular town offers. And that also kind of links to the interlinkage between one smaller town to a bigger town, which kind of got highlighted in your research that there's not much of commuting. So, I mean, is the distribution of these services and facilities one of the reasons for less communication, or it's entirely based on employment opportunities that particular area offers? These were my two questions.
You said that the impact of remittances on there is positive impact of remittances on service sector, but not much on industry. So it's not a question, but just I'm wondering whether the impact on service sector, it is very sudden, more or less sudden, but manufacturing takes some time to develop because it's risky. So that is the question. It is much easy for a service sector to grow, but manufacturing might take some time, but it might happen after some years.
Not to that. That was another thought that came up. Is that I mean, it probably was not the case in the places which you have selected. A lot of places, for example, the industrial towns, a manufacturing unit was actually embedded in that particular area to trigger the urbanization in that particular district. And would you classify that as urbanization from or it's like how would you classify that?
Sure. So I'll start with that one because it's more of a clarification question. I would not classify that as urbanization from within, because I think that that is much more the classic story of urbanization, right? There's some kind of capital investment in, you know, a tradable industry. It draws in, typically it draws in migrants from somewhere else. So that to me is the classic story of urbanization. Whereas I'm talking about, you know, sort of a more endogenous kind of process, right? Where the internal population growth and the sort of homegrown bootstrapped economy, right, is kind of what's typifying it. So in terms of the other questions, so you know, your question about the pattern of migration influencing the possibilities for this kind of economic change. So absolutely. One thing that that Arnab and I did whenever we were doing this kind of econometric analysis is we also ran the same regressions looking at seasonal migration. So we looked at households that we classified as translocal, meaning they receive remittances and they have at least one child dependent. So it gets to that issue of social reproduction happening in place. And that's where we found this sort of statistically significant impact on agriculture and services. But we also looked at what about how districts with high levels of seasonal migration, how that impacts local economic change. And we found no impact. And I think that speaks to the fact that seasonal migrants tend to be that tends to be the most precarious form of migration. It tends to involve the lowest wages and the shortest stints away from home. And so the amount of remittances, if any, that involves are not sufficient to enable this kind of shift out of agriculture that we're seeing. So that I think kind of speaks to your question about the patterns of migration and how they influence. And just to clarify, I mean, I think folks know, but we're using seasonal the way that the NSS uses it. So 1 to 6 months away from home over the past year. Your second question, can you maybe clarify it a little bit? So are you asking whether there is a kind of hierarchy of services within the district, or
Between two towns in
Yeah.
one particular district.
Yeah.
Particularly when we're talking about an integrated spatial planning approach. It may be because of the employment opportunities or like, you know, the migration which is happening because of economic reasons, but it's also to access the services which a city might be providing, for example, higher education, a higher degree of healthcare services which might be present. So I mean, when we're talking about integrated spatial planning, it's not only about economic opportunity, it's also about like other reasons of immigration, which probably will be happening at different levels. It could be within the district also, it could be within the state, and it could be within the state also. So were any of those factors accounted for when you were particularly saying this kind of particular research, and this particular like, you know, challenge of lack of spatial planning? Would that be better influenced when we look at multiple factors which will probably contribute to the migration?
Yeah, so I mean, for sure that any kind of, as you're saying, any kind of integrated approach to spatial planning has to account for not just these issues of economy and employment, but also all the social functions and services, et cetera. So I 100% endorse you on that. I think the point I was making was that an integrated approach to spatial planning has the potential to help facilitate or resolve some of these issues around the urban economic development in, you know, a place like Begusarai district. The kind of connectivity between different parts of the district does also, I mean, from my interviews, I know does also, of course, relate to where people have to go to access different kinds of services. So certain kinds of services require them to go to the district headquarters. Other kinds of services they can get at the block level, you know, so that, of course, is shaping the kind of trips that people make and the way that these different settlements are integrated with each other. But I was sort of pointing specifically towards how it might help us to think about or resolve some of these issues around the kind of labor market integration and what possibilities that comes with. But for sure, I mean, the broader spatial planning perspective would require us to think about all those different functions of a city. And then, Kanu, so I think, yeah, I think the reason why we don't see an effect on manufacturing employment is because it's more capital intensive to compete in manufacturing, and the barriers to entry are not just in terms of capital, but more broadly speaking, the barriers to entry are much higher. And so it's a little bit of a chicken or egg problem that these towns are facing, right? Because they're part of the reason why they're not able to provide, more pathways to economic mobility, better job opportunities, et cetera, is because they're not part of the tradable economy. But they're not part of the tradable economy because they don't have the levels of capital or skill or other kinds of strategic kind of comparative advantages that they would need to compete in the tradable economy. So whether or not this is just a temporary stage and eventually there will be more investment in manufacturing, perhaps. I'm a little bit skeptical just because it's so easy for firms in Bihar to be outcompeted by other parts of the country. I mean, I've done some research in a weaver community in Bhagalpur district, and they are oftentimes there's a lot of people from that community that migrate to Gujarat, and they've seen the power looms in Gujarat, and they're like, there's no way we can ever compete with this. So I think that there are possibilities, but it's a steep hill to climb.
I agree, like large scale manufacturing is,
Mm-hmm.
but I was thinking like very small scale, like yeah, chips, food, all these
Mhm.
small things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That might grow. maybe.
Yeah.
But obviously, like all these big industries, that is very difficult really.
Right.
But that's exactly where the e-commerce and all of this competition kicks in. Is your question? Yeah. Why don't you just throw that in? Mix.
The topic was circular migration, in which we now know that the new budget is being out, and we now have a significant increase in budget, around 3.16 lakh crores. So, do you think that this budget will influence people to come back and start their own enterprises or work for the increased opportunities that will be there? No question.
Potentially, I think it depends on how that money is spent, the implementation of the schemes, whether a potential capital for small enterprises is accessible. As an example of a type of policy that was being implemented at the state level when I was doing my research, I don't remember the exact name of the scheme at this moment, but the state government basically launched a scheme for entrepreneurs to provide startup capital, but the system of distribution was a lottery. So, that's not a very strategic. I understand why you would do it for transparency purposes and to reduce, possibilities of corruption, but it's not a very strategic approach to growing, for economic development, right? If you're giving out startup capital to entrepreneurs via a lottery system. So I think, hopefully that expenditure is used a little bit more strategically this time, but I think it really depends.
So, yeah, can I just you can ask after me. So are you saying, I'm hearing you say that your description of urbanization from within is very well taken, but the essential issue here is that there's not enough employment being created in any of these. If you look at just the network of towns that you showed within Begusarai districts, none of them is an employment magnet, really. They're all developing in this urbanization from within kind of way. So this is not a sustainable pathway to urban development. It's urbanization, but it's not urban development the way we think of urbanization as a pathway to better economic prospects and human development. So are we saying that the classic model of urbanization and this model has to be mixed up spatially in some way for this to actually work and move people forward? So what's the future of places which have which are only urbanizing in this particular way? That's, I mean, I know it's a big question that
No, it's a
doesn't
great
have answers,
question.
but it sort of begs that
Yeah.
thing. And yeah, Vishwadit, you can add.
This question is related to that data,
Mhm.
GHSL
Mhm.
data. So initially you have used GHSL and the non-farm census data
Mhm.
to classify the fastest growing district.
Mhm. That's just urbanizing, yeah.
So that GHSL data is based on the built-up data and the nightlight data,
Built up and population, not nightlight, yeah,
not nightlight.
right.
Because sometimes I'm also using that GHSL
Mhm.
data. So I just feel that that data is sometimes overclassified, and because of that overclassification, you will get that growing extra or the high growth rate in some small pockets. So that this problem is mainly you can see in the case of Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and the Chhattisgarh.
When you say overclassified,
Yeah, means the build-up overclassification.
built up, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that challenge when it comes to nightlight data in particular, that
Built
like
up
if
as
you
well.
have, or built up, that if you have, for example, like a large oil refinery or something, then that's classified as, 100% built up and therefore urban, even though no one's living there.
Right.
But the kinds of places that I'm investigating they don't have that sort of large scale infrastructure investment in that way. They have a lot of infrastructure investment in roads, but not in these kind of like large utilities and facilities that would create that type of overclassification distortion that you're talking about. But it's a good question. I'm also thinking about in some of my future work switching to world pop data for that reason. I don't know if you use that.
Yeah. I've also used that. But same problem is there also.
With world pop,
Even
I thought it was better.
landscan data. Even
Okay.
landscan data.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can.
That data is good for when you're working on the developed cities in the developed countries.
Mhm.
That data is good. You can
Mhm.
use that data. But when you will use that data for the India or the country like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, then that data is not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Devrupa, you
Yeah.
had a question.
So, first question that I have is that how close are these towns or villages located near bigger cities, immediate bigger cities? Because you talked about circular migration. I want to know these male migrants, how far are they migrating from the place of their origin? And secondly, the urbanization from within is basically the natural increase in that region, right? So there is fertility rate and mortality rate. If I assume fertility rate is more or less constant, mortality rate is not very high. That means there is a probability of a high aged population, which is contradictory to the youth population who we consider 15 to 64 as the working age population. So what is the demography in these areas? If there are better medical facilities and educational facilities, so if I assume there are more children and healthcare facilities there, what are the health and medical facilities there? Are they again going to the nearest metropolitan or bigger cities for accessing these facilities, or new hospitals and educational facilities are coming up near these towns and villages that is actually leading to the regional growth, regional development of the region? So these two are my questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Sahil had a follow-up question on the lack of women's participation. He wants to know how much of this do you think could be attributed to your early argument about the sociological difference that urbanization from within poses in terms of differently reorganizing the social structure in these agrarian urban settings where people don't move in. So basically, the sociological structure hasn't really changed. Then can we really expect the kind of changes that we expect in an urban region in these places?
Yeah, it's an interesting. Okay. So, sorry, can you remind me of your first question? Just
How far are these towns and villages
Okay.
located from the bigger cities or metropolitan cities?
So, I mean, in the case of a town like Mansurchak, like I said, it's about an hour by a two-wheeler to Begusarai, the city, which is the historical largest city in that region, but not really an employment magnet, right? It's kind of a
District headquarters.
yeah, it's a district headquarters. There is a refinery in Borani, which is like a few, maybe 10 kilometers from Begusarai, but it's not really a hub for employment. And so the kind of migration patterns I'm describing are long distance. I mean, people are moving from this district to, I mean, historically they were moving for agricultural work in places like Punjab. Now they're mostly moving to metropolitan areas. So yes, outside the state. Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Aurangabad, Surat. These are the kind of common destinations that you hear. Sometimes you hear about Kolkata, but these are the majority. In terms of the medical facilities, people are not usually traveling all the way to a district headquarters for routine kind of medical procedures or checkups. They're usually going to the sort of block headquarters or to a kind of intermediate town that might be larger than the Mansurchak, larger than the town that they're from, but not as far as the district headquarters. Yeah, so I don't know the exact spatial distribution of those facilities, but from my field work, I can say that they're not traveling very far. But it's a good question in terms of how that's related to the overall regional development of these places.
So, the demography of the region, like at one hand, we are having a working class population, but also like what is the aged population or the child population in the area? So in future, like whether you can predict a kind of urbanization, this is going to continue or it is going to change.
Yeah.
So
It's a good question. Yeah. So I looked into kind of, I did some basic kind of estimation to see, based on the prediction that we have of falling fertility rate, because in Bihar, it's about 3 at this point. And so it's predicted that the fertility rate will fall to replacement levels in about somewhere between 30 and 40 years. So my guess is that we can expect this process to continue for the next several decades, and then it will probably level off. At least in terms of the rate of population growth and densification. I don't think that means that we're then suddenly going to see a hollowing out of Bihar, right? Because at that point, the population of the state will be about 200 million, about 130 million today. So I think it's at least, several generations away before we would see a fundamental shift in kind of the population structure of Bihar. But I think the question you're raising is a really important one, which is what happens when this population starts to age? Because right now, I mean, Bihar is effectively in its demographic dividend, if we can call it that, right? So I think the challenges could be even greater at that point when the aging begins. Which I guess, I don't know if that relates to your question about the future of these places, but I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think what's so interesting is that the classical model of urbanization is also broken in the sense that the exclusions of our metropolitan labor markets help to explain why this process is occurring the way that it is, right? So that is the uneven development process. What we're not used to seeing is that sort of exclusion from the metropolis can also lead to this other pattern of urbanization in the places that are effectively left behind. And so I think there's a question around kind of what is our comparison when we're thinking about the urbanization of this place, right? Are we thinking about the opportunities for human development in comparison to this kind of classic model of urbanization and the classic sort of metropolitanization process? Are we thinking about it in comparison to something called agricultural involution, which basically means you have increasing population in an agricultural setting and no economic change, right? No economic transformation, just falling labor productivity in agriculture, which is in some ways the kind of the worst human development outcome. So it's somewhere in between, right? It might be a second best form of of urbanization in terms of its ability to create kind of productive urban economies. But of course, it's not just about people's wages. It's also about we have to think about human development in this multidimensional way. So the fact that people can retain these connections to the place where they have their roots, their ancestors, their place attachments. Maybe there's a trade-off there, on the kind of sociological side of things. So I think it's complicated to answer the question of what this means for human development, except to say that I think it comes with its own set of trade-offs, but so does the classic urbanization process. And to the question about the agrarian social structures and women, I think it's related to the point we were just saying, because we know that urbanization in general has not been good for women's labor force participation in India. The metropolitan areas don't see very high rates of female labor force participation, at least not in North India. So, so again, we could say that the classic model is also broken to some extent in terms of its ability to enable women to join the.
Yeah, but there's also evidence, especially from work that Neelan and group they did outside Patna, to show that there's lots of invisibilization of women's work. So there's possibly changes because of it, because so much of it is intra-household right now, that data sets are not capturing some of those changes, and it will take longer for them to start.
And I do see that in the context of my fieldwork. I mean, you ask someone, who works in this enterprise, and they say, well, I run the enterprise. Does anyone else work in the household? No. Well, who works in the household if who works in the enterprise if you have to go to the district headquarters one day? Oh, well, then my wife will come and sit.
Exactly.
But, so there is that same pattern for sure.
So I think that's a good note to close. We've done a whole gamut from caste to gender to planning to infrastructure to economy. So checked all the boxes. Maybe the only thing that we didn't discuss, which usually gets discussed in urban circles nowadays, is climate vulnerability. That could also have come up. It's just that no one happened to bring it up, but I'm sure that's something that played into your fieldwork too. But thank you very much, everyone, for showing up. And thank you so much, Greg, for engaging with all of the questions patiently. And look forward to more such talks, and look forward to suggestions from people on the table for who else we could call to NIUA. Thank you and good evening, everyone.